At 11:47 p.m., a military K9 planted himself in the center of Ravenport Medical Center's trauma bay. 3 and refused to move. The dog had blood drying in his fur, a dead handler somewhere in the parking garage, and 80 pounds of trained aggression pointed at every person who tried to get close. 3 doctors backed down. 2 federal agents put hands on their weapons. The man bleeding out on the gurney behind the dog had no name on his chart, no identification, and a gunshot wound that was going to kill him in the next 20 minutes if somebody didn't act. Then Elena Voss walked through the door, looked at the dog, and said one word, quietly, in German, and the impossible happened. The room went completely still. Because nobody in that hospital knew she spoke German. Nobody knew why the dog listened. And nobody had any idea what Elena Voss actually was. If this story has you on edge already, stick with me until the very end, because it only gets more intense from here. Hit that like button, follow along so you don't miss what happens next, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The shift started the way most Tuesday night shifts started at Ravenport Medical Center, badly. Elena Voss clocked in 7 minutes late because the parking structure on 4th Street had a broken gate arm and a line of cars backed out onto the main road. She changed in the locker room faster than anyone should have to, pinned her badge crooked, and walked onto the floor with her hair still damp from the rain outside. Night charge nurse Deborah Finch was already at the station with the look she reserved for people who tested her patients, that flat, deliberate expression that said she'd been counting the minutes. 7 minutes, Finch said. Gate was broken. Elena pulled up the handoff notes on the terminal. I'll stay late. You'll stay late and you'll owe me a sundae. Elena didn't argue. She'd learned early that arguing with Finch was a transaction that always cost more than it was worth. She scanned the board. 4 rooms occupied, 2 pending discharge, 1 in imaging. Routine. She grabbed a set of vitals forms and started walking the floor before Finch could add anything else to the bill. Ravenport Medical wasn't a big hospital. It wasn't a prestigious one either. It sat in the middle of a mid-sized city that the interstate had mostly bypassed 15 years ago, which meant the hospital's funding had been hovering at the edge of adequate for most of Elena's career there. The trauma bay was functional. The equipment worked most of the time. The staff were competent and overworked in roughly equal measure. Elena had been there for 4 years, which made her something of a veteran on the night shift, which was a different kind of veteran than the morning shift people who brought in cookies and organized birthday parties. Night shift veterans had quieter currencies. They knew where the extra blankets were. They knew which pharmacy was open past midnight if a patient needed something the floor couldn't cover. They knew how to get 3 things done simultaneously without making it look like any of them were urgent. She was pulling a blood pressure reading on room 6 when the radio at the nursing station erupted. Not a normal page, not the polite 3-tone alert that meant someone needed assistance. The raw voice of a paramedic who'd been running hard and was still running. Ravenport, incoming critical, GSW to the upper chest, entry wound left side, BP dropping, patient is unresponsive, ETA 4 minutes. A pause, the sound of tires on wet asphalt coming through the channel. Be advised, we have a K9 unit on board. Handler is down, animal is agitated. You need to have someone ready for that before we get there. The radio crackled and cut. Elena walked back to the station. Finch was already on the phone. 2 other nurses had come out of rooms and were standing in the corridor looking at each other. GSW, Elena said, mostly to herself. Trauma Bay 3, Finch said, hand still on the phone. Elena, get it set up. She went. That was the job. You went. She had the bay prepped in 3 minutes, IV lines, the crash cart moved to the correct position, O negative on standby, airway tray open. She'd done it enough times that her hands knew the sequence, and her brain could do something else while they worked. What her brain was doing was running through the paramedic's words. GSW, upper chest, entry wound left side. Pneumothorax was possible, hemothorax was possible. If the bullet had traveled, the bay doors banged open. They came in fast. 2 paramedics pushing the gurney and a third, younger, doing chest compressions. And behind them, tethered to a rail on the stretcher by a 6-foot lead, was the dog. German Shepherd. Male, big, maybe 90 pounds, black and tan with a tactical harness that was the same color as dried blood, which was the color it was in several places. The dog wasn't injured as far as Elena could see, but his eyes were scanning the room with the intensity of something that had already made decisions about every person in it. His ears were up. His hackles were up. He was moving because the stretcher was moving and he was attached to it, but everything about his body said that the moment he stopped moving, he was going to make problems. "Need you to get that animal out of here," said the trauma attending, Dr. Fitch, who had come in behind Elena. He was already gloved and moving toward the patient. "Now." "Handlers down," one of the paramedics said. "DOA in the garage. Animal is bonded to the patient. We couldn't separate them without—" The dog's bark was a single percussive sound that bounced off the concrete walls and made everyone in the room stop moving for half a second. Dr. Fitch stopped moving for a full second. The dog was between him and the patient now, not by accident. "Get animal control," Fitch started. "There's no time," Elena said. Fitch looked at her. He had that attending physician expression that meant he was deciding whether to dismiss what he just heard. Elena was already moving toward the dog. "Was?" "Was?" Fitch said with a warning in it. She wasn't stopping. She kept her body language loose and forward, no sudden angles, hands down, and she made the sound before she was within 6 feet, low, even, not loud. "Ruhig." The dog's ears shifted. His weight dropped back from his front legs, just slightly, a half-inch change that nobody else in the room probably noticed, but that Elena recognized because she'd seen it before, in a different country, in a different context that she never talked about at work. She stopped 2 feet from him. He looked at her. Not the way an agitated animal looked at a threat. Not the way a trained dog looked at a command. He looked at her the way a working dog looked at the first person who talked to him in a language he actually understood. She held her hand out, below his muzzle, not toward him. He put his nose on it. The room was completely silent. "Good boy," she said, and it came out in German too, without her meaning it to. "Bleib." "Stay." She took the lead from the rail on the stretcher and held it, and the dog sat. Not because she'd forced him, because she'd asked. "Okay," she said, to the room without turning around. "Go." The team moved. Dr. Fitch moved. The paramedics moved back, and 2 trauma nurses came in to take over positions, and the room became the organized noise of people doing urgent things. Elena stood with the dog at her side and did the other half of her job, monitoring, calling out readings, relaying information, while holding a military K9 on a leather lead she'd unclipped from a dead man's equipment. Nobody asked her how she'd done it. They were too busy trying to keep the patient alive. She didn't explain. The patient was a mystery in the most literal sense. No wallet, no phone, no dog tags. Those had been removed, she noticed, and not recently. The absence was clean, deliberate. His paperwork said John Vance, which was the kind of name someone put on paperwork when they didn't want to put a real name on paperwork. Age listed as 41. Allergies, none listed. Emergency contact, a phone number that when the desk tried it, connected to nothing. He was in bad shape. The GSW was left chest. The bullet had been a through and through at a downward angle that suggested he'd been shot from above and to the right while he was moving. Somebody who'd been paying attention would be able to reconstruct a lot from that, but Elena wasn't going to say so out loud. The pneumothorax was real, and they'd addressed it. His pressure was coming up. Fitch was good at what he did, whatever else Elena thought of him, and he worked the case efficiently for 40 minutes until the patient was stabilized and moved to a monitored room on the 2nd floor. The dog went with him. Elena went with the dog because there wasn't another option, and because nobody told her not to, and because someone had to. That was when the federal agents arrived. There were 3 of them. 2 in the kind of tactical clothing that civilian government agencies thought looked understated and didn't, and a 3rd in an actual suit with an ID badge that read, Norris, Department of Defense. They came out of the elevator with the energy of people who'd been running since before Elena's shift started and were not interested in anything that slowed them down. Room for the patient admitted under Vance, Norris said, to Elena, because she was standing in the corridor nearest the elevator and was, apparently, the first hospital staff he'd encountered. Down the hall, second door on the left, she said. We need it secured. Nobody in or out without our authorization. I'm his nurse. Norris looked at her badge. We'll reassign. Elena looked at him steadily. He's critical. You can't reassign his nurse mid-shift without risking... We'll reassign, Norris said again, with a finality that was meant to end things. She let it end. For now. She walked down the corridor to the nursing station, wrote up her first hour of notes on the patient, and waited. The dog, Mace, she'd seen the name on the harness once she'd had the chance to look, was sitting outside the patient's door, which the agents had apparently decided was acceptable because moving him wasn't something they'd successfully accomplished either. Finch found her 20 minutes later. They're asking for a nurse reassignment, Finch said. She didn't sound happy about it. I told them you were mid-shift and I'd see what I could do. He's not stable enough to... I know. I told them that too. Finch dropped her voice slightly. They're DOD, Elena. I don't have a lot of room to push. Who is he? No idea. And I wasn't told to find out, which means I'm not going to find out. Finch looked at her with an expression that was less the judgment face and more something else, something that was almost assessment. You want to keep the case? I want him to survive the night. Those are different things. Not right now, they're not, Elena said. Finch was quiet for a moment, then, I'll tell them I can't reassign until morning for patient safety reasons. That's 3 hours. That's enough. Look. She went back to the room at 1 a.m. under the pretense of checking the monitoring equipment, which genuinely did need to be checked because the oximetry lid had come loose. Norris was outside the door with one of the tactical clothes agents. He watched her go in but didn't stop her. The patient, she was still calling him Vance, in her head, was sedated but restless. His vitals had stabilized in the range Fitch had predicted, which was not a comfortable range but a survivable one. She adjusted the lead, checked the drip rate, looked at the wound site to make sure the dressing hadn't shifted. Mace watched her from the corner of the room, where the agents had apparently decided to let him stay because the alternative was worse. He didn't get up. He tracked her with his eyes. I know, she said quietly. The dog's ears moved. He's okay for now. I'm working on it. It was a ridiculous thing to say to a dog. She knew that. She also knew, from experience she didn't discuss, that military working dogs were not pets and were not trained like pets, and that explaining a situation to one while they watched you wasn't entirely ridiculous if you knew what you were doing. Mace's eyes stayed on her hands as she worked, checking for threat indicators, running the assessment he'd been trained to run. She moved deliberately, clearly, no sudden angles. Ruhig, she said again, and he put his head down on his paws. Not sleeping. Resting. She was almost at the door when Vance's monitor spiked. It wasn't dramatic, it never was at first. A subtle climb in heart rate, a blood pressure dip. She was at the bedside before it had time to become something worse, adjusting, reading the numbers, calculating. Something in the drip rate had drifted. She corrected it and watched the line settle. 30 seconds, from spike to resolution. She stood there another 2 minutes to be certain. When she turned around, Vance's eyes were open, just barely. The sedation was still working, he wasn't lucid, but his eyes were open and they were aimed at her with a focus that was disorienting in someone who should have been unconscious. Trauma patients sometimes broke surface like this, briefly, before the medication pulled them back down. She leaned forward slightly. You're in a hospital. You're safe. We're taking care of you. The words he said were very quiet and came out broken by the effort it cost him to say them, but they were clear enough. Don't let them move me. She straightened up. Okay? His eyes closed. She stood there for a moment in the monitored dark of the room. Mace had his head up again. Yeah, she said, to nobody in particular. I heard him. Baitek. She found out his real name at 1:34 a.m., not from the DOD agents, who weren't telling anyone anything, but from a source she hadn't expected. The paramedic who'd brought him in, the youngest one, the one who'd been doing compressions, a kid who couldn't have been more than 2 years out of his EMT certification, was still in the waiting area. He'd been held there, she understood now, because the agents had questions for him. He was sitting in a plastic chair with a paper cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, looking at the floor. Elena sat down next to him. He looked up. He had the expression of someone who'd been involved in something that had outgrown his frame of reference. "You doing okay?" she asked. "Yeah." Then, "No, not really." He turned the cup in his hands. The handler, the guy who was with the dog, he was already gone when we got to the scene. There was nothing to do for him. "I know." He had the dog's leash wrapped around his wrist, like he was holding on even when... He stopped. Elena didn't fill the silence. "The patient," he said after a moment, lower. "His name's not Vance." "I know that too. I heard the call go out before we reached the scene. They were trying to shut it down, the radio channel, but..." He glanced toward the corridor, toward the agents who were not currently looking in their direction. "He's a commander, military. They said Commander Hale. Mason Hale." Elena filed that away without a reaction. "Thank you." "Is he going to make it?" She stood up. "I'm going to do everything I can to make sure of that." What she did next was the kind of thing that looked from the outside like a nurse doing her job. She moved between the station and the room. She updated charts. She flagged a minor anomaly in the secondary drip to the covering physician. Not Fitch, who'd gone off duty, but a younger attending named Pero, who she'd worked with before and trusted enough. She asked Pero to look at the wound site imaging again, couched it as routine follow-up. Pero looked. Pero came back to her with a face that said he'd found something. "There's still something in there," he said low. "Not the bullet. The track shows the through and through, but there's a fragment small, and it's close to..." "The subclavian," Elena said. He looked at her. "How did you know that?" She didn't answer. "If it shifts..." "I know. I'm going to recommend we get a thoracic consult." He looked toward the patient's room. "Are those agents going to let me?" "Go through their chain. Norris. He'll make the call faster than you think once he understands the risk." Pero nodded and went. Elena watched him go, then turned back to the station and started making the calculations she'd been making since 1 a.m. Mason Hale. Commander. Through and through GSW with a trajectory that told a story. A dead K9 handler. 3 DOD agents who'd arrived inside 20 minutes of the ambulance, which meant they'd been somewhere close, which meant they'd known something was going to happen, or they'd known immediately that something had happened because they were monitoring the situation in real time. Neither of those options was comfortable. "Don't let them move me." She pulled up the hospital's internal layout on the station terminal. Not the patient directory, not the case files, the building schematics, which were technically accessible to all staff for emergency evacuation purposes. She looked at Trauma Bay 3 and its adjacencies. She looked at the second floor room and its adjacencies. She looked at the parking structure, the service entrance, the loading dock. She was doing this not because she'd been trained to do this, not at Ravenport Medical anyway, but because she had been trained to do this, in a different life, in a different context, and the training had not gone away just because she'd filed it in a drawer and moved to a mid-sized city with a hospital that had outdated equipment and a parking gate that didn't work. She was still doing the calculations when the lights in the east corridor went out. Not a flicker, not a single bulb. The whole east corridor, the corridor outside Mason Hale's room, went dark. And Mace, inside the room, began to bark. Mace's bark was not the sound of a dog startled by darkness. It was a working alert, sharp, repeated, directional, the kind of sound that meant the animal had identified something specific and was reporting it. Elena was off her chair before the second bark finished. She moved down the corridor toward the east wing, not running, because running drew attention, and she didn't want attention right now. She wanted information. The emergency lighting had kicked in along the main corridor, dim, yellow-green strips along the floor, but the east corridor itself was still black. The door to Hale's room was 30 feet ahead. Norris was already there, flashlight out, hand on the door handle, and the other tactical agent, she still didn't know his name, was on the radio. "Power's out east wing, second floor. We need..." "It's not the building," Elena said. Norris turned. "Back to the station, ma'am." The building's emergency lighting runs on a separate circuit from room power. If the east corridor is dark but the strip lighting's on, something cut the east corridor specifically. She said it the way she'd say anything clinical, flat, informational, not as an argument. That's not a breaker. That's targeted. Norris looked at her for a moment. His flashlight was pointing at the floor between them, and she could see his face well enough to watch him recalibrate her. He hadn't been doing that before. Before she'd been the reassignment problem, the nurse who wasn't cooperating. Now she was saying things that fit with something he already knew. "Get inside," he said. To her, not to the other agent. She went in. Mace was at the window, not at the door. At the window, which was the east-facing window, with a view to the parking structure and the service alley between the hospital's main building and its outpatient annex. He was barking at the window with the absolute conviction of an animal that had already identified a vector and was waiting for everyone else to catch up. Elena crossed to the window and looked out. The alley was dark. The parking structure was dark on the east face, but there was a light where there shouldn't have been. Not a flashlight, not a headlight, something small and stationary in the second level of the parking structure, in the section that had been blocked off since the construction project started 8 months ago. A mobile screen, maybe. Someone with a phone or a tablet. Waiting. East face of the parking structure, second level, northwest corner of the blocked-off section, she said, without looking away from the window. Norris was behind her. She heard him relay it into his radio. She pulled back from the window and went to the bed. Hale's monitors were still running on backup power. The medical equipment circuits were isolated from the room power, another thing she knew about the building that she'd had reason to look up tonight. His vitals hadn't changed. Whatever was happening outside hadn't reached him yet. Mace had stopped barking. He was standing at the window still, rigid, but quiet now, the way a trained dog went quiet when the alert had been received. He'd done his job. He was waiting to see if the humans would do theirs. "Good boy," Elena said. He didn't look at her. He kept looking at the window. She understood that. "Hey, Sam." The man from the parking structure never came through a window. He came through the service corridor on the second floor's east side, a utility passage that ran behind the patient rooms and was used by housekeeping and maintenance for equipment access. Elena didn't know this immediately. What she knew, 4 minutes after the lights went out, was that the second tactical agent had left his position at the east end of the main corridor to respond to Norris's radio call about the parking structure, and that the service corridor door, a plain gray door 30 feet south of Hale's room that said authorized staff only, was slightly open. She'd walked past it twice tonight. It had been closed both times. She did not walk up to it. She walked back to the nursing station instead, picked up the desk phone and called security. The night security officer, a man named Pruitt, who she'd spoken to maybe 4 times in 4 years, answered on the second ring. "Pruitt, it's Voss on 2. I need you to pull the service corridor access log for the East Wing, second floor, right now. I need to know if anyone badged in the last 15 minutes. What's going... Right now, please." She heard him typing. The phone felt heavy in her hand. Down the corridor, Norris was back at Hale's door, the other agent somewhere in the stairwell or outside, and the east corridor was still dark except for the floor strips. "Last badge entry, service corridor East Wing 2, was at 9:43 p.m., Pruitt said. "Night maintenance. Before that, but the door's open now." A pause. "How do you know it's... Is there another way in from that corridor that doesn't require a badge?" Another pause. Longer. "There's a manual release on the annex side. Fire safety. Doesn't log." "Get up here," Elena said. Quietly. "Don't use the radio." She hung up and turned around and nearly walked into Pero, the attending, who had come to find her with the look of someone who'd been waiting to deliver news and had gotten distracted by the general tension of the corridor. "Thoracic consult approved," he said. "Norris signed off faster than I expected. Dr. Valdez is coming in. She can be here in 40 minutes. "Good. Thank you." He dropped his voice. "What's happening out here?" "Power issue." He looked at the dark corridor, the agents, the general atmosphere of a situation that was clearly more than a power issue. "Elena, there might be someone in the service corridor. Keep the patient in that room and don't let anyone move him until Valdez has looked at that fragment." Pero's expression shifted through several things in quick succession. He landed on something that looked like the decision to trust her. "Okay? And close your patient's room doors." He went. She went the other direction. Thus, Pruitt arrived in 4 minutes, which was actually fast for Pruitt, who was not young and had a bad knee. He'd mentioned to her once during a 3 a.m. slow stretch. He came up the main stairwell, and she met him at the landing. "The manual release," she said. "Where does the service corridor come out on the annex side?" "There's a door into the annex maintenance bay, ground floor, but the corridor itself goes all the way up to 3 before it—" He stopped. He was looking at her face. "How do you know someone came in that way?" "I don't. I think someone came in that way." She paused. "Does anyone in this hospital know that corridor layout better than you?" He thought about it. "No." "Then I need you to tell me where someone would go if they came in through the annex, went up the service corridor to 2, and came out. Where? What's on the east side of the service corridor at floor 2? Pruitt pulled out his phone and opened a building map. The actual facility map, the maintenance version, which showed things the evacuation posters didn't include. He turned the screen toward her. She looked at it. The service corridor ran parallel to the east patient rooms. There were 3 access points on the second floor. One near the supply closet, one behind the nursing station, and one that came out, she traced it, behind the medication room, which was 6 feet from the medication room door, which was 10 feet from the door to Hale's room. She handed Pruitt back his phone. "Stay here." "You should call those federal agents." "I will. Stay here." She walked back down the corridor. Norris was outside Hale's door. He looked at her when she approached, and she saw him start to say something. The reassignment conversation again, or some version of security protocol. "Medication room," she said. "Service corridor access behind it. Someone may have come through from the annex." Norris's expression shifted the same way Perot's had, but faster. He got to the operational conclusion faster, without the intermediate steps. He turned and covered the 6 feet to the medication room door in 2 long strides, hand going to the firearm she'd assumed he was carrying. He stood to the side of the door, reached out, and opened it. The room was empty. She released a breath she hadn't decided to hold. Norris checked the service corridor door at the back of the room. Closed, no manual release engaged, no sign of disturbance. He came back out. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite accusation and not quite apology. "Your source on that?" he said. "Building schematics. I accessed the maintenance map from the front desk through Pruitt in security." She held his gaze. "I'm not making things up." "I didn't say you were." "You were deciding whether I was." He didn't answer that, which was its own answer. He keyed his radio and updated his partner. She turned and walked back toward the station and was almost there when she heard it. Not Mace this time, not a bark, just a sound from behind the wall, from inside the service corridor that ran behind the medication room, from somewhere between the medication room and the supply closet. A sound like a footstep on a metal floor plate. She stopped, turned back. Norris was already moving. What happened in the next 4 minutes was not orderly. Later, she would piece it together from what she'd seen and what she'd heard and the parts she'd had to fill in from Pruitt's account and the agent's report. But in the moment, it was noise and motion and the specific texture of a situation that had been heading somewhere bad and had arrived. The man in the service corridor had not come through the annex. He had come in during the construction shift 6 hours earlier with credentials that had been good enough to get him through a temporary contractor badge process that the hospital's security had since discovered was compromised. He had waited in the service corridor for his window, and his window had been the power cut. Not to the east corridor, it turned out, but to the security camera system on the east side of the second floor, which had gone dark at 1:52 a.m., and which nobody had flagged because the hospital's security monitoring was, like most things at Ravenport Medical, running at slightly below capacity. The light in the parking structure had been a decoy, or maybe a signal to someone else, or both. Elena didn't know that yet. What she knew was the sound from the wall, and then Norris moving, and then the service corridor door behind the medication room coming open. Not from inside the room, from the supply closet 30 feet down, the third access point she'd seen on Pruitt's map. The man came out fast and low. He had something in his hand that she recognized as a tactical syringe, not unusual looking enough to stop him at a checkpoint, lethal in context. He was moving toward Hale's door, and he was moving with the directness of someone who had a plan and had run it enough times in his head that he was operating on automatic. Norris shouted. The man didn't stop. Norris closed the distance from the wrong angle. He'd been positioned for the medication room, not the supply closet, and the man was going to reach Hale's door before Norris reached him. Elena was closer. She did not think about it in those terms. She thought about it in the terms she'd thought in before. In a different context, in a different life, where thinking took too long and the body ran the calculation faster than the mind did. She moved into the corridor toward the man, not away from him, and she did the one thing she was physically capable of doing that would slow him down without putting her directly between a trained operative and an armed federal agent in a narrow hallway. She hit the crash cart. Not into him. She wasn't trying to hit him. She wasn't close enough, and it would have been stupid. She shoved the crash cart from its position outside Hale's room into the middle of the corridor, and it went sideways with the noise of metal and equipment and a very loud impact against the wall, and the man's path was blocked for the 2 seconds it took Norris to cross the remaining distance and close him down. 2 seconds was enough. It was not clean. Nothing about it was clean. There was shouting from somewhere. Pruitt maybe, or Perot from down the hall. Mace was barking again from inside the room. Elena had hit her hip on the corner of the crash cart hard enough that she'd be bruised for 2 weeks. The man went down in the corridor with Norris on top of him, and the second agent appearing from the stairwell 45 seconds too late to be useful, but useful enough to take over the restraint while Norris caught his breath. Elena stood with her hand against the wall and waited for her heart rate to do something reasonable. It took longer than she'd have liked. Norris zip-tied the man's wrists with something from his jacket, and the second agent, she finally heard someone use his name, Kettler, got on the radio with a long string of code words she didn't know. She stayed out of the way, which was where she should be, and she watched the man on the floor and tried to extract information from what she could see. He was not panicked. His breathing was controlled. His face was arranged in the expression of someone who had anticipated this possibility and was not surprised by it. He had a contractor badge from a construction company she didn't recognize. His hands were the wrong hands for a construction worker. "He's not going to talk," Elena said. Norris looked at her. "Not to you, not here." She pushed off the wall. "Which means you need to figure out who sent him before he gets access to whatever communication he's going to try to make." "That's not your—" "I know it's not my department." She met his eyes. "I'm just telling you what I see." He held her gaze for a moment, then looked away, which was the closest she was going to get to acknowledgement from him at 2 a.m. in a dark corridor with a detainee on the floor. She would take it. She went into Hale's room. Mace had stopped barking again, settled back to his window position, ears rotated toward the door, processing. She checked the monitors. Hale was still sedated, still restless. The vitals were where she needed them. She sat down in the chair beside the bed that she'd moved into the room at the start of the shift and hadn't moved back. Her hip ached. Her hands had a slight tremor she was monitoring clinically, the way you monitored your own reactions when you'd been doing something that engaged the older parts of the nervous system. She was fine. She'd been less fine in situations that looked more ordinary. "Valdez is still 30 minutes out," she said, to herself mostly. Then, because Mace had turned his head from the window to look at her, "He's going to make it." The dog watched her for a long moment. Then he crossed the room, 4 slow steps, and lay down on the floor beside the chair. She didn't move. She let him settle. His weight was solid against her feet, warm, real, and she was glad for it in a way she wasn't going to articulate. Dr. Valdez arrived at 2:44 a.m. with a resident who looked like she hadn't slept in 30 hours, and a manner that suggested she was accustomed to being woken up at bad hours and had made her peace with it long ago. She was small, compact, with gray-streaked hair and the specific kind of certainty that surgeons developed when they'd been operating for 20 years and had stopped being interested in impressing people. She reviewed the imaging Elena had asked Perot to pull. She reviewed the vitals. She reviewed the fragment location. "Close," Valdez said, "but not moving yet. Could it move?" "If his pressure spikes." Valdez looked at the monitor. "Or if someone moved him." "He told me not to let that happen." Valdez looked at her. "He was conscious?" "Briefly. Around 1:30. What else did he say?" Elena considered how much to give. "That was it?" Valdez studied her for a moment with the eye of someone who was good at identifying what people weren't saying. She didn't push. I want to watch him for 2 hours. If the fragment shifts, we go in. If it doesn't, we reassess at 6. Norris needs to approve the extended stay. Norris can take it up with my chief of surgery. Valdez pulled out her own phone and started typing. I've dealt with DOD before. They want him alive. I want him alive. We want the same thing, and I'll explain that in terms he can understand. Elena almost smiled. It was the first time that night that someone had walked into the room and immediately oriented themselves the same way she had, toward the patient, not the politics of the patient. It was a relief that felt physical. She went back to her chair. Mace lifted his head, checked her, put it back down. The corridor outside was quieter now. The detained man had been removed by Kettler, and a third person, who'd appeared from somewhere, federal security or local law enforcement, she wasn't sure. Norris was making calls. Pruitt had been sent back downstairs with what sounded like a very gentle instruction not to discuss the evening with anyone. At 3:11 a.m., Hale's eyes opened again. This time he was less sedated and more present. He turned his head, slowly, with the deliberate control of someone managing pain, and looked at the room. Looked at Valdez, who was reviewing charts. Looked at Mace, who raised his head. Looked at Elena. "You're still here," he said. His voice was rough and low, but there was recognition in it. "I'm your nurse," she said. "They were going to reassign you." They were. She stood and moved to the bed to check his lines. I convinced them it wasn't a good time. He watched her work. The dog. "Mace is fine. He's been here the whole time." Something in his face shifted, not relief exactly, something more complicated than that. "Danner," he said. She knew the name was the handler's. She didn't answer immediately. "He's gone," Hale said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." He closed his eyes for a moment. She watched his jaw tighten and then deliberately release. The kind of controlled grief that people learned when they'd been in situations where grieving had to wait. "Someone came for me tonight," he said. "Yes." "They stopped him." She paused. "We stopped him." He opened his eyes. He looked at her with an expression that was, for the first time since he'd arrived, genuinely evaluating her. Not the way someone looked at a nurse. The way someone looked at a person they were trying to accurately place. "Who are you?" he said. It was a simple question. She'd been asked it before, in different forms, in different rooms, by people who'd watched her do something that didn't fit their category for her and needed to update their framework. She picked up his chart and noted the time of consciousness and the words exchanged, the way she was supposed to. "Elena Voss," she said. "Night shift." He held her gaze. "Right," he said, and the word had a weight to it that said he understood she wasn't going to answer the real question. Not here, not yet. Maybe not ever. Mace had gotten up and walked to the side of the bed. He stood there until Hale moved his hand slowly, the IV line shifting, and rested it on the dog's head. Mace went still under the contact. Elena watched the two of them and felt the thing she always felt in moments like this, and didn't have a clean word for, the specific ache of people and animals who'd been in hard places together and carried it in the way they touched each other. She looked away. At 3:29 a.m., the DOD's field communications team arrived in the parking structure outside. 3 vehicles with equipment she recognized the outlines of from the window. They were not there for the detained intruder. They were there because somebody had decided this location was no longer secure for reasons beyond a single intruder. And the communications that Norris had been making in the corridor had produced a response that meant the night was about to change shape in a way she hadn't anticipated yet. Norris appeared in the doorway. He looked at Hale, then at Elena, then at Mace. His expression had moved past whatever category he'd originally put her in. He hadn't found a new one yet. "Voss," he said, "I need 5 minutes." She set down the chart. Hale was watching her again from the bed, with the fragment still in his chest and the communications teams outside, and the night wearing on toward a kind of morning that was not going to look like a normal morning. Mace had his head against Hale's hand and his eyes on the door. "Okay," she said, and followed Norris into the corridor, and that was when he told her what was really happening. Not what had come through the door tonight, but what the intruder in the corridor was the edge of. What the communications teams in the parking structure were there to address, and why the next 6 hours were going to determine whether Mason Hale made it out of Ravenport Medical Center at all. Norris didn't take her to a conference room or a private office. He took her to the alcove at the end of the corridor, the one with the broken vending machine and 2 chairs nobody used because it was the closest space with no patient rooms adjacent and no cameras. The East Side camera outage was still active and apparently nobody had fixed it yet, which meant this stretch of corridor was the least monitored space in the building. She noticed that. She noticed that he'd chosen it deliberately. "The man in the service corridor," Norris said, keeping his voice at a register that wouldn't carry. "His name is Gregor Falk. We've been looking for him for 11 months. She waited. "He's a contract operative. He's been used by at least 3 different buyers in that time, but the current contract, the one that brought him here tonight, traces back to someone inside the operation that Hale was running." Norris paused. Inside. Not external. Someone on the access list. A leak. A source. Active. With current clearance, which means they knew the transport route, the hospital destination, and the timing. He looked at the floor. "We had 4 possible extraction sites for Hale tonight. We chose Ravenport because it was the least likely. We made that decision 6 hours ago. And Falk showed up anyway." Within 2 hours of Hale's arrival, Norris's jaw worked, which means whoever is feeding information has access at a level that... He stopped himself. She understood he was editing in real time, deciding how much she needed versus how much he was comfortable giving. "The transport team is compromised. We don't know at which level." Elena thought about what that meant structurally. Not emotionally, structurally. "So the 3 vehicles in the parking structure are not from my office." He looked at her directly for the first time in several minutes. "They're from a separate command element that was activated 2 hours ago. They report to a different chain. I don't control them, and I don't fully know their mandate beyond securing the asset." "Hale." "Yes." She processed this. "You're telling me because in the last 4 hours you've demonstrated that you understand this building better than my team does, and you have skills that are not consistent with your personnel file at this hospital, and I need to know how much I can rely on what you tell me." He said it plainly, without accusation, which was more unnerving than if he'd been confrontational. "So I'm telling you what I know, and I'm asking you what I should know about you." The vending machine hummed behind her. Down the corridor, she could hear Valdez giving instructions to her resident. She could hear, faintly, Mace shifting in Hale's room. "I'm a nurse," she said. "That's not a deflection. It's what I am now." "And before?" She held his gaze. "Before is before. What matters tonight is that I know this building and I know trauma. And I will tell you anything I see that's relevant because I want Hale to survive. That's the full scope of the arrangement I'm offering." Norris looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "The separate command element is going to want to move Hale, probably within the hour. They'll argue it's a security necessity. Valdez won't clear him for transport." "They may not ask Valdez." Elena stood up straight. "Then you need to make sure they do. I'm not..." "Norris." She kept her voice even. "There is a bone fragment 6 millimeters from his subclavian artery. If he's moved without surgical clearance and that fragment shifts, he bleeds out in under 4 minutes. No field kit fixes that. No extraction route accounts for it. If the people in that parking structure move him without surgical clearance, they will kill him themselves." She let that sit for a second. "Tell them that." In those terms. He held her gaze. "You're sure about the 6 millimeters?" Valdez said close. "I'm extrapolating from the imaging I looked at, but yes, close enough." He was quiet. "All right," he said. And then, which she hadn't expected, "Thank you." She walked back down the corridor toward Hale's room, and the night pressed itself tighter around the building. The separate command element sent one person inside at 3:55 a.m. Not a team. One person, which was either confidence or protocol. She wasn't sure which. A woman in her late 40s with close-cropped gray hair and a bearing that made Norris look relaxed by comparison. She had no badge Elena could see. She introduced herself to no one and went straight to Hale's room and stood in the doorway for 30 seconds, looking at the patient, the dog, the monitors, and then, last, Elena. "You're the nurse," the woman said. "Yes." "Voss?" "Yes." The woman came into the room, looked at the monitor readings, looked at the imaging Valdez had left on the portable viewer. She did this with the speed of someone who could read medical data but hadn't come here to read medical data. She'd come to make an assessment and was doing it fast. "Transport in 60 minutes, she said. "Medical team travels with him." "No," Valdez said from the corner, where she'd been reviewing notes and had apparently been waiting for exactly this. She said it without looking up. "Not until I'm satisfied the fragment is stable for movement and I have a surgical suite available at the destination. Those are my conditions and they're non-negotiable because I am the only person in this building who can authorize transport without causing his death." The woman looked at Valdez. Valdez looked back at her. 90 minutes, the woman said. 2 hours minimum. And I need to know the destination has a thoracic capability equal to or better than what we have here. A beat. The woman took out her phone, made a call, said 3 words Elena couldn't catch, listened, said 1 more, and ended it. 2 hours. Destination is Harkerfield Medical. It has a level 1 trauma capability. "I know Harkerfield," Valdez said. "Their thoracic team is adequate." "Fine." The woman turned back to Elena. "You'll stay with him during transport." Elena hadn't expected that. "I'm a hospital nurse. I'm not asking." She looked at the woman and understood that this was not a conversation she was going to win, and that winning it was probably not what Hale needed anyway. "Okay," she said. The woman left. Mace tracked her exit with his eyes but didn't move. Valdez set down the viewer. "Harkerfield," she said to Elena. "You know what that is?" "Military medical facility. Active duty military medical facility. Classified access." She looked at Elena with an expression that said she'd upgraded her assessment of the situation in the last several minutes. "They don't bring civilians to Harkerfield." Elena didn't have an answer for that. She went back to Hale's monitors and did her job. At 4:18 a.m., the fragment moved. Not far. Valdez's resident caught it first on the continuous imaging feed they'd set up, called Valdez, and Valdez was at the bedside in under a minute, with her hands already moving toward her kit. Elena was 2 steps behind her. "How much?" Elena asked. 2 millimeters? Maybe 2.5. Valdez's voice was flat and focused. "It's not in a critical position yet, but the trajectory, if he has any kind of pressure event, what do you need?" "I need a surgical suite right now, not in 2 hours." Valdez looked up. "Get Norris." Elena got Norris. She covered the corridor in 12 seconds and found him at the east stairwell door and told him in 2 sentences. He went on his radio before she finished the second one, and she went back to the room. Hale was awake. The sedation had lightened over the last hour, and he was more present than he'd been at 3 a.m., not alert, not functional, but aware of what was happening around him with the specific attentiveness of someone who'd trained themselves to monitor their own condition. "Bad," he said. Not a question. The fragment shifted. Valdez wants to go in. Elena checked his pressure, still holding for now. "You're not in critical territory yet." "Yet." "Yet," she confirmed. She appreciated that he didn't want soft language. "Norris is working on getting the OR opened. We have time if his blood pressure doesn't—" Hale's monitor alarmed. Not the critical alarm, the precautionary one. The yellow alert that meant a value had moved outside the acceptable range. His pressure was climbing. Slow, but real. And the reason it was climbing was visible to Elena immediately because she'd been watching for it. The sedation had thinned enough that pain was reaching him, and pain drove sympathetic response. And sympathetic response drove pressure, an elevated pressure in a chest cavity with an unstable fragment. "I need sedation adjusted," she said to Valdez's resident, who was already reaching for the chart. 10% increase, now don't wait for a countersign. I'll take the documentation. The resident hesitated for half a second, the appropriate hesitation of someone who understood the rule about countersignatures and was measuring it against the situation in front of her. Then she adjusted the drip. Elena watched the pressure line. It climbed for another 20 seconds. She counted them, and then flattened and began slowly to descend. Hale's eyes found her. "Stay still," she said. "I mean it. Do not move." His jaw was tight. The pain was readable in his face despite the sedation, the deep, tidal kind that broke through pharmacology when it was serious enough. But he stayed still. She saw him make that choice actively, override the body's need to shift, to find relief. "Good," she said. "Keep that." Valdez was back on her phone. Elena heard her saying surgical suite, heard her saying suboptimal field conditions, heard her saying liability falls to you if we don't go in, and it shifts further, which was the kind of direct surgical argument that tended to cut through administrative resistance. Mace had his head up, watching Elena and Hale both, his eyes moving between them. Norris appeared in the doorway. "Or 3 is available. Dr. Laro is on call. He can assist." "I don't need assist," Valdez said, ending her call. "I need a scrub tech and an anesthetist." "Anesthetist is in the building. Scrub tech, call Dr. Pero. He's cross-trained," Elena said. She didn't look away from Hale's pressure reading. "He's down the hall." A pause. "Okay." Norris disappeared. Hale made a sound. Not quite a word. His hand moved toward Mace, and the dog was already there, close enough to touch. "He'll be here when you get back," Elena said. "You don't know that." "I know that Mace has been attached to you since they brought you through the door, and that nobody, including the DOD, has managed to move him. He'll be here." Something in Hale's face shifted. It wasn't a smile. He wasn't anywhere close to a smile. But it was a recognition. Like she'd said something accurate and he was cataloging it. "Voss," he said. "Yeah." "Don't leave the building." She looked at him. "Whatever they tell you," he said, and his voice was thinning with the sedation increment, "don't leave the building tonight." She held that for a moment. "Okay," she said. They moved him to OR3 at 4:31 a.m. Elena stood in the scrub sink hallway outside OR3 and listened to the sounds of a surgical suite beginning and felt the 4 a.m. specific variety of exhaustion that was different from tiredness, deeper, more cellular, the kind that came from sustained alertness in a body that had been running on adrenaline and institutional coffee, and the specific discipline of not falling apart when things kept escalating. Her hip was a solid ache now. She'd have a bruise the size of a hand on her left side by morning. She'd been at work for 6.5 hours. The shift ended at 7. Pruitt appeared around the corner with 2 paper cups of coffee and an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Something between unsettled and committed. He handed her a cup. "The man they took out of the corridor," he said. "Falk." "What about him?" "Before they took him, he said something." Pruitt wrapped his hands around his own cup. "One of the paramedics who was still in the building overheard it. He was on the phone with someone. They gave him a phone, apparently, his own phone. 1 call. And he said," Pruitt paused, "he said, 'Package is in surgery. Source is still active.'" Elena went still. "Source is still active," she repeated. "That's what the paramedic heard." She thought about what Norris had told her. A leak. An active source with current clearance. Someone on the access list who had known the transport route, the hospital destination, the timing, and who had fed that information to Falk or to whoever had contracted Falk. Falk had been captured. The intruder was neutralized, but the source was still in play. Which meant someone who had passed through the net tonight, someone in this building, or someone with access to communications from this building, had reported to Falk's handler that Hale was in surgery. She turned toward the OR doors. "Pruitt," she said, "who has had communication access in this building tonight, outside of the DOD channels?" He frowned. "What do you mean? Staff phones, the desk system?" "Anyone who made an external call from a hospital line between midnight and 4 a.m., I need that list. I can't pull call logs without. Can you pull them with security authorization?" "I'm night security." "Then yes," she said. "You can pull them. Pull them. Don't show them to Norris yet. Don't show them to anyone. Just pull them and find me." He looked at her. Then he turned and went. She stood outside the OR and drank the coffee, which was terrible, and listened to the sounds of Valdez working. and tried to think clearly about who in this building had known enough and had enough access to make a call to a dead phone number in the last 4 hours. The answer that came back to her was not one she wanted. It took Pruitt 18 minutes. She found him at the security desk on the ground floor, his face tight, a printed log in front of him. "I flagged the external calls," he said. 14 calls from hospital lines between midnight and 4:17. 12 are logged accounts. Staff calling family, night pharmacy, standard. He pointed at the sheet. 2 are from extensions I can't immediately account for. 1 from the supply room on 2. "The supply room doesn't have a phone," Elena said. "It does. Maintenance line goes through the external exchange, not the internal system. It's not on the regular directory." He looked at her. "It was used at 2:48 a.m., duration 43 seconds. The outgoing number isn't in the hospital directory, and it's not a local prefix. 2:48 a.m., 20 minutes after the power cut, 12 minutes after Norris had identified Falk in the corridor. Whoever had made that call had known Falk was caught, or had suspected it, and had reported out. The other unaccounted call? Extension in the physician's lounge, 3rd floor. 1:19 a.m., 40 seconds. He paused. "That one I actually can trace. The lounge sign-in sheet shows only one person logged into the lounge between midnight and 2 a.m. She looked at him, waited. "Dr. Perro," Pruitt said. She heard herself breathe. Perro, who had come to find her with the thoracic consult approval, who she'd trusted with the fragment information and the surgical recommendation, who she'd just told Norris was cross-trained as a scrub tech, who was right now in OR3 with Mason Hale. She was moving before she finished the thought, up the stairs, not the elevator, because the elevator was slower and she couldn't stand to wait. 2nd floor, corridor, the door to the OR suite. She hit the stairwell between 2 and 3 and came out on the OR level, and the scrub nurse outside OR3 looked up from her station with an expression that was about to become an objection. "OR3, Elena said. "Perro. Did he go in?" The scrub nurse checked her board. "Dr. Perro entered the scrub area 6 minutes ago. He's—" "Get Norris," Elena said. "The DOD agent in the East Corridor. Call him right now and tell him OR3 is compromised. Tell him those words." The scrub nurse stared at her. "Right now?" Elena said. "I'll explain it to him after." She pushed through the door into the scrub area. The scrub area was a narrow corridor with sinks along one wall and the entry to OR3 at the far end. A double door with a small reinforced window. Through the window she could see the surgical field, the lights, Valdez at the table, her resident across from her, and to the left of the resident, scrubbed in and gloved, Perro. He was in the right position. He was in the right clothes. He looked like exactly what he was supposed to look like, which was the point. Valdez's back was to him. Her resident's focus was on the surgical site. Nobody was watching Perro's hands because nobody had a reason to watch Perro's hands. Elena watched his hands. He was holding a retractor, correct for the position, correct for the procedure. His right hand. His left hand was slightly below the table line, which was not unusual in a long assist, except that she could see his left thumb moving, a small, repeating press, the way someone's thumb moved when they were toggling something small. A switch. A transmitter. Something in his palm that hadn't been there when he'd scrubbed in, or had been hidden inside his glove before he gowned. She had 4 seconds to decide what was accurate and what she was reading into an overloaded night. 3 seconds to decide if the cost of being wrong was acceptable. She pushed through the double doors. "Stop," she said. Every head in the room turned. Valdez's hands didn't move, a surgeon's instinct, don't disturb the field even when interrupted, but her eyes came up. "Voss," Valdez said, her voice sharp and controlled. "You cannot be in here?" "Perro's left hand," Elena said. Perro looked at her, and the thing that happened in his face, not panic, not confusion, was recognition. The fast, cold recognition of someone who had just processed that they'd been seen and was now calculating. He moved his left hand above the table line. It was empty, but his fist was closed. "Open your hand," Elena said. The room had the taut, suspended quality of a held breath. Valdez not moving, the resident frozen, the anesthetist at the head of the table half out of her seat. "I don't know what you think, Ekish," Pero started. "Open your hand. Now." Mace's bark came through the wall from somewhere, distant, from the recovery staging area where they'd kennelled him during the procedure. Not a working alert. Something else. Something that sounded almost like a response to the tension that had traveled through the building in ways that only animals tracked. Pero looked at Elena across the surgical table, over the open chest of a sedated man with 1,000 calculations running behind his face, and his fist didn't open. The OR doors came open behind her. Norris came through at a controlled run. Norris cleared the double doors in 2 strides and read the room in under a second. The surgical field, Valdez's frozen hands, the resident, the anesthetist, Pero across the table with his fist closed, and Elena standing inside the sterile zone in street clothes. And he did not hesitate. "Pero," he said, "open your hand and step back from the table." Pero looked at him. The calculation in his face had not resolved. It was still running, still weighing, and Elena watched him reach the end of it in real time. The place where a person arrived when the remaining options had all collapsed into one. He opened his hand. In his palm, half hidden by the edge of his surgical glove, was a device the size of a thick coin, matte gray with a single recessed button. A transmitter. Small enough to carry into a sterile environment without triggering a standard security sweep. Sophisticated enough to tell her that whoever had supplied it had resources. Valdez made a sound, not a word, something anterior to words, and her hands went still over the open surgical site. Her resident made the same instinctive move, pulling back from the field without being told, the medical training kicking in before the human response did. "Don't move away from the table," Elena said, to both of them. "Not yet. The site is still open." It was the right call, and they both knew it, which was the only reason they listened. Leaving an open surgical site unattended was not an option regardless of what was happening in the rest of the room, and Elena's voice had the quality of someone who understood that. Norris crossed to Pero in 3 steps and removed the device from his palm, gloved hand, careful, and pulled Pero back from the table by the arm. Pero didn't resist. He'd moved past resistance into something else, a kind of flatness that Elena recognized as the affect of someone who had run out of moves and was now simply waiting to see how the rest of it unfolded. "Outside," Norris said, to Pero. Then to Elena. "Can you assist?" She looked at Valdez. Valdez was already looking at her. "You said Pero was cross-trained," Valdez said, and there was an edge in it that was not accusation and not quite controlled. "I didn't know," Elena said. It was not an apology, it was a fact. Valdez held her gaze for a moment, then looked at her resident. "Tran, you're assisting. Boss, I need you in scrubs and gloves. You're observing vitals and managing the anesthetic monitor. Martinez," to the anesthetist, "stay on the field. Nothing changes on your end." She looked back at the surgical site. "We finish this. Nobody moves until we finish this." That was Valdez in a surgical crisis, Elena understood. Not thrown, not unraveling, just recalibrating to the available resources and moving forward because the alternative was a man bleeding out on a table. Elena went to the scrub sink. Chet. It took 11 minutes to get scrubbed, gowned, and gloved. It took Valdez 43 more minutes to complete the procedure. Fragment removed intact, no secondary bleed, subclavian artery undamaged. Elena monitored the anesthetic panel and called readings to Martinez when requested and watched Valdez work with the focused efficiency of someone who had stopped being rattled by the situation because the situation no longer had anything to offer her that was worse than an open chest. The fragment came out at 5:34 a.m. Valdez held it up in the clamp and looked at it and set it in the specimen tray without comment. Elena exhaled. The resident, Tran, young, steady throughout in the way some people were steady under pressure without fully understanding that they were, released a breath at the same time. They didn't look at each other about it. Some things were private even in a shared room. Closure took another 20 minutes. They moved Hale to recovery at 5:57 a.m. Elena stripped her gloves in the scrub corridor and leaned against the sink and let herself have 30 seconds of being a person who had been awake for 9 hours in a situation that had kept escalating and had not stopped escalating yet. 30 seconds. Then she went to find Norris. He was in the consultation room at the end of the OR corridor, a room the size of a large closet with a table and 3 chairs and a whiteboard that hadn't been erased in months. Pero was seated at the table with Kettler standing behind him and a second woman Elena hadn't seen before in the doorway, DOD credentials, she gathered, from the separate command element. Pero looked up when Elena came in. Something crossed his face. Not guilt, she didn't think it was guilt, but something adjacent to it, the expression of a person confronted with the specific face of the person they'd put at risk. "Surgery's done," Elena said. "He's in recovery." Norris, who was standing to the side with his arms crossed, looked at her with what was becoming his standard expression for her, the one that was still recalibrating and hadn't finished yet. "Fragment out?" "Clean. Valdez says no secondary damage." He nodded once. Then he looked at Pero. "Let's go back to the call at 119, he said. Pero said nothing. "The physician's lounge, 3rd floor. 40 seconds to an outbound number that traces to a routing service." Norris kept his voice even, not aggressive, which Elena understood was a technique. "We'll pull the routing chain eventually. That process runs faster when you help it." Still nothing. "The transmitter," Norris said. "The model is 2 years old. We've recovered that specific variant before. It's associated with a supply chain that goes through 3 intermediaries, all of which are known to us." He paused. "Which means the people who gave it to you are already inside a network we've been mapping for 11 months. You're not protecting anyone who isn't already exposed. You're only deciding how quickly this resolves and in which direction." Pero looked at the table. He had his hands flat on the surface, and Elena noticed they were not entirely steady, a small tremor, not the kind that meant fear, the kind that meant exhaustion and the collapse of sustained tension. He'd been carrying this for longer than tonight. "I need to speak with a lawyer," he said. "You will," Norris said. "That process begins the moment we leave this building, and it will happen faster if you give me something to work with before we go." A long silence. Kettler hadn't moved. The woman in the doorway was watching Pero with a stillness that was different from the others, more patient, more accustomed to waiting. "The fragment information," Pero said, finally, to the table. Not to Norris, not to Elena, to the table. They needed to know if he was going to make it, whether it was worth sending Falk in or whether he was going to die anyway. He paused. "I told them he was stable enough, that the fragment was close but not immediate." His jaw tightened. "That's all I passed, the imaging findings. I didn't know what they were going to—" "You knew Falk was coming," Elena said. Everyone looked at her. She hadn't planned to speak. The words had come out with a flatness she didn't intend as rhetorical. Pero looked at her. "I didn't know his name. You knew someone was coming and you told them the window was open." She held his gaze. "That's what the call at 119 was, before the power cut, before Falk came through the corridor. You told them Hale was stable enough to reach." His hands pressed harder against the table. "I didn't know what they were going to do." "You knew enough," she said. The room held that for a moment. Then Norris said quietly, "Step outside, Voss." She went. "This check." The corridor outside was empty except for a DOD security officer at the far end who'd materialized sometime in the last hour. Elena walked past him to the window at the corridor's end, east-facing, overlooking the parking structure where the command vehicles were still positioned, their running lights visible in the early pre-dawn gray. The sky had the texture of an hour before sunrise, not dark, not light, that particular suspended quality where color hadn't committed yet. She was still in hospital-issue scrub pants and a clean top they'd found her from the OR supply because her uniform had been in contact with too many things tonight to remain clinical. Her badge was clipped to the scrub top, slightly crooked, same as when she'd started the shift. She thought about Pero. Not with anger. She didn't have the energy for anger at that particular temperature right now, but with the specific kind of exhaustion that came from having trusted someone's competence and had that competence exist alongside something else entirely. He'd been good at his job. She'd worked with him for 2 years, and his clinical instincts were sound. that coexisted with what he'd done tonight, and she didn't know what to do with that coexistence except acknowledge it and put it somewhere it couldn't distract her. Mace's bark came from somewhere below, muffled by floors and walls but recognizable by now, his specific register. Recovery staging was on the ground floor. She went. Mace was in the corridor outside the recovery room in the custody of Kettler's subordinate, a younger agent named Ryall, who had clearly not anticipated dog-sitting when he'd reported for duty and was maintaining a cautious 3 feet of distance from the animal. Mace was sitting, not distressed, but his ears were rotating toward the recovery room door every few seconds in the systematic way he'd been doing all night, checking, rechecking, orienting. When he saw Elena, he stood up. "Hey," she said. She crouched down to his level, which she didn't do with dogs she didn't know, but which she did with Mace because she did know him by now in the limited and specific way of a long, difficult night. He put his nose against her forearm. "He made it out of surgery. He's in there." She was talking to a dog again. She'd done it more times tonight than she could count. She didn't care. Ryall looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between skepticism and something warmer. Does he actually understand that? "He understands something," she said. "He's been tracking the situation all night. He's smart." She scratched behind Mace's ears. He tolerated it, which from him was practically enthusiasm, and stood up. "Can I go in?" Ryall checked something on his phone. "Norris cleared you for recovery access." "Yes." She went in. Hale was in the third bay, curtain partly open, monitors running. The anesthetist, Martinez, had handed off to a recovery nurse Elena vaguely recognized from the day shift overlap. The sedation was lightening again, managed this time, controlled. His color was better than it had been at any point in the night. The fragment was gone, and the bleeding had been nil, and the subclavian was intact, and those were the facts that mattered. Elena sat in the chair beside the bay. Not because she needed to monitor him, that was the recovery nurse's job now, but because Hale had told her not to leave the building, and she hadn't, and she was tired in a way that required sitting. At 6:21 a.m., Hale surfaced. It was gradual. A minute of restlessness, the eye movements behind closed lids, the hands flexing. Then his eyes opened and found the ceiling, and then, slowly, found her. "Surgery," he said, flat, scraping. "It's done. Fragments out. No vascular damage." He processed that. Pero. So he'd heard something, in the half-conscious state. Or he'd been more aware than the sedation should have allowed. "He's in custody." Hale's eyes closed for a moment, opened again. "The device." "Recovered. Norris has it." "Did it transmit?" She paused. "I don't know. We got to it fast. The transmitter was active for less than a minute before Norris pulled it. Whether the signal reached anyone..." She shook her head. "That's above my pay grade." Something in his expression, dry, barely there and then gone. "What is your pay grade exactly?" "Night shift nurse," she said. "Ravenport Medical, step-down unit." "Right," he said, the same weight as the first time he'd said it. She let that sit. "Danner had a daughter," Hale said after a moment. "Not to her, not to the room, just into the air." "She's 9. She didn't fill that silence. Some things didn't need filling. "He was 6 months from rotating out," Hale said. "He'd been pushing for a domestic assignment. He wanted to coach soccer." He paused. "I approved the assignment for this operation, this specific one." "I know," she said. He looked at her. "I know what you're doing," she said, "and I can't tell you to stop because it's the right thing to be doing. But not here, not tonight, not like this. Your body just went through surgery, and your pressure needs to stay regulated, and grief will do the opposite of that." He held her gaze. "So what do I do with it?" "You hold it," she said. "For now. You hold it until you're in a place where holding it won't kill you." She met his eyes. "You've done that before." A long beat. "Yeah," he said. "I have." She looked away first. "Matt." Norris found her at 6:48 a.m. with the information she'd been waiting for. The transmitter had sent a signal. Brief, 40 seconds of active transmission, which matched the interval between Pero toggling the device inside OR3 and Norris removing it from his palm. The signal had gone to the same routing chain as the 1:19 a.m. call. The separate command element's communications team had intercepted and backtraced the receiving endpoint in the 70 minutes since the OR, and the receiving endpoint was not, as might have been assumed, offshore or embedded in an anonymous network. It was a room in the Millhaven Suites Hotel, 4 blocks from Ravenport Medical Center. "They were close," Elena said. "Observation position," Norris said. "They were watching the building. The signal from Pero's device would have told them the procedure was complete and whether—" He stopped. "Whether Hale survived the procedure," she said. "Yes." "And if he hadn't?" "Then his extraction would have been unnecessary and the operation wound down here." Norris said it without expression, which was its own kind of expression. "The hotel room had 2 occupants. One left approximately 40 minutes ago, and we don't have a location. The second was still on site when our team arrived." 20 minutes ago, she said. "Yes, the one who left. We're working on it." Elena thought about Falk in the corridor, the transmitter in Pero's palm, the power cut to the cameras. This had not been improvised. Someone had built a layered operation, a planted insider, an external operative, an observation post close enough to receive real-time signals, and they'd built it fast because Hale had only arrived at Ravenport Medical at 11:47 p.m., and it was now 6:48 a.m., which meant they hadn't built it fast, which meant they'd built it before Hale arrived, which meant the hotel room and the observation position predated last night, and whoever had been in that hotel room had been waiting for Hale to surface somewhere, any of the 4 possible extraction sites Norris had mentioned, for long enough to have an operation ready at each one. "How long has Pero been in contact with them?" she asked. Norris looked at her steadily. "Initial communication, based on what he's given us so far, goes back 8 weeks. 8 weeks. She sat with that. 2 months of coming to work, running shifts, doing the thing he was good at, and carrying this alongside it. She thought about the 37 times she'd spoken to him in 8 weeks, the cases they'd consulted on, the handoffs, the once he'd brought coffee to the station at midnight and she'd thanked him for it. "The one who left the hotel room," she said. "Did they get a description?" "Partial. The hotel's lobby camera shows a man, 6 feet roughly, dark jacket, left through the side exit at—" Norris checked his phone. 6:14 a.m. 6:14. 17 minutes after Elena had gone into recovery staging to find Mace, while she'd been in the building's lower level. "Norris," she said, "does the command element know the identity of Hale's operation target? The person he was trying to locate when he was shot?" Norris's expression shifted. "That's classified at a level I don't need." "I'm not asking you to tell me who it is," she said. "I'm asking whether the people who attacked him last night know that Hale's operation was close to identifying that person." A beat. "Yes, that's the working assessment." "Then the person who left the hotel room at 6:14 is not running away," she said. "They're reorienting. The first approach failed, the inside asset is burned, the external operative is in custody. They need a different angle." She looked at Norris. "Hale's in recovery," she said. "His location in this building is not a secret from anyone who is in that hotel room. The command vehicles in the parking structure are visible from the street. This building is still the known location." Norris was already on his radio before she finished. The next 40 minutes were not Elena's to manage, and she understood that. But understanding it did not mean she was capable of going to the break room and sitting with a vending machine sandwich while the building reconfigured around her. She stayed in the recovery corridor, and she watched. The command element moved fast. She gave them that. 2 additional security positions materialized at ground floor entry points. Kettler moved to the parking structure. Ryle repositioned with Mace to a spot outside recovery that put the dog between any entry corridor and Hale's bay. At 7:09 a.m., Finch arrived for the start of day shift and found Elena in the corridor in scrub pants and a DOD security officer between her and the nursing station, and her expression cycled through 4 distinct emotions in about 3 seconds. "Voss?" she said. "I know," Elena said. "Do you want to explain?" "Oh, I will, later. Right now I need you to pull whatever authority you have as charge nurse and formally prevent any patient transfer from Recovery Bay 3 without surgical clearance from Valdez. In writing, time-stamped. Finch stared at her. "I know how it sounds," Elena said. "Finch, please." Finch looked at the security officer, looked at Elena. Did the calculation that Elena had watched several people do tonight, the recalibration, the recategorization, and arrived at the same place they'd all arrived, which was trust, based not on explanation, but on the accumulated evidence of the last 7 hours? "Give me the form," Finch said, and went to the station. The security officer watched this exchange. Then he looked at Elena with an expression that was new on a night full of new expressions, something that was close to simple respect. She didn't acknowledge it. She wasn't doing any of this for acknowledgement. She was doing it because Hale had told her not to leave the building, and she had not left the building, and she was not done yet. At 7:23 a.m., the hospital's main entrance camera flagged an entry. A man in a dark jacket who had changed to a light one, but whose gait and height matched the 614 hotel lobby footage. Within a margin, the command element system called significant. He came through the main entrance with a visitor badge, the print-on-demand kind, self-issued at the kiosk in the lobby, which Ravenport Medical offered for visiting family and which required nothing more than a name and a room number. The room number he'd entered was not Hale's room number. It was the supply room. Elena heard the radio traffic from Norris, clipped, fast, the coordinates relayed to Kettler and the ground floor positions. She heard the response that said lobby was moving to intercept. She heard Norris say east stairwell, which was where the supply room access was, and she looked at Rel and Mace in the corridor ahead of her and thought about the supply room on the second floor and the service corridor it connected to, and the fact that she'd stood in this building for 4 years and knew every access point between any 2 rooms on the second floor. She did not go toward the stairwell. She went to the recovery bay. Mace saw her coming and was on his feet before she reached him. She looked at Ryal. "Move him inside. Now. Close the bay curtain and don't open it regardless of what you hear." Ryal hesitated for exactly 1 second. Then he moved. She followed them in and pulled the curtain. Hale was more alert. The sedation had thinned to functional levels. His eyes were tracking. His hands had grip. He looked at her and at Mace and at Ryal and read the room correctly. "Talk," he said. "Man from the hotel is in the building. Your room number isn't what he pulled at the kiosk, but the service corridor connects." "I know the building layout," he said, which confirmed several things she'd suspected. "Norris is moving on the lobby and east stairwell," she said. "But if he knows the service corridor access—" "He knows it," Hale said. "Then we have maybe 4 minutes." Hale looked at Ryal. "Your sidearm." Ryal blinked. "I can't give you—" "Son," Hale said, with a quiet that was somehow more authoritative than volume, "I am a commissioned officer, and this is my recovery room, and I am asking for your sidearm. Make the decision." Ryal made the decision. He unholstered and held it out. Hale took it, checked it in 3 seconds, and held it at rest at his side. He was in a hospital gown with an IV still running, bruised across the left chest, fresh surgical closure under the gown, and the firearm looked completely natural in his hand, in the way things did when they'd been there long enough. Mace had moved to the curtain and was standing at it, not alerting, just positioned, waiting. Elena stood between the bed and the curtain and thought about the 4 minutes she'd estimated and whether it was accurate and what she'd do when it ran out. From the corridor outside, muffled from the direction of the service access, came the sound of a door. Mace went still in the way animals went still when they were 1 second from action, every muscle loaded, body dropped low. The curtain moved, and then Norris's voice came from the corridor, not alarmed, controlled, with the specific flatness of someone who had a situation in hand, and the sound of a second body against the wall, and handcuffs, and radio traffic that resolved into the code she'd learned meant secured and the channel cleared, and the curtain stopped moving. She breathed. Hale lowered the firearm. Mace looked at Elena. She looked back at him, and the dog held her gaze for a long moment, the steady, measuring look he'd been giving her since 11:47 p.m., since the trauma bay, since she'd said one word and he'd decided she was worth listening to, and then he turned and walked to Hale's bedside and lay down on the floor next to it. Done. The assessment was done. The verdict was in. Ryle took his sidearm back with the expression of someone who had just participated in something he was going to be processing for several weeks. Elena sat down in the chair beside the bay. Her body had decided, without consulting her, that it was finished performing. Hale looked at her. He looked like a man who had survived a gunshot wound, surgery, 2 separate assassination attempts, and a very long night, and who was measuring the face of the person who had been present for all of it. "Voss?" he said. "Yeah." "Your shift ended?" He glanced at the clock on the wall. 45 minutes ago. "I know." He held her gaze, and then very quietly, "Thank you." She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that would carry the right weight for the night they'd both just come through, and she'd learned a long time ago that some acknowledgments were smaller and more accurate when you didn't add anything to them. She nodded once, and that was when Norris came through the curtain with an expression that had finally, after 8 hours, resolved into something clear. And what it had resolved into was not the look of a federal agent who needed to manage a loose end, but the look of a man holding a phone that he needed her to answer. "It's the director of the separate command element," he said. "They want to speak with you." He held the phone out. "Specifically you, not me. You." She looked at the phone, looked at Hale, who was watching her with an expression that was unreadable but present. Looked at Norris. "Why?" she said. Norris glanced at Hale. Something passed between them. Not quite an exchange, more an acknowledgement. "Because the man we detained in the corridor tonight," Norris said, "identified himself under initial questioning as working for a network that has been under investigation for 30 months. The investigation has a case officer." He paused. The case officer's name came up in the hotel room, not Falk's file, not the observation logs. A separate document, operational. "And your name is in it." She went very still. "Not as a target," Norris said quickly. "As an asset. Historical. Flagged inactive 7 years ago." He held the phone toward her. "Which is why the director wants to speak with Elena Voss, night shift nurse, Ravenport Medical Center, who is apparently a great deal more than her personnel file suggests." The phone waited in his hand. Hale said nothing. Mace looked at her from the floor. She reached out and took the phone. She put the phone to her ear. "Ms. Voss." The voice on the other end was a woman's, older, measured, the kind of voice that had spent decades in rooms where every word was weighted before it was spoken. "My name is Director Calloway. I'm going to be direct with you because I think you prefer that." "Yes," Elena said. "The document recovered from the Millhaven Suites identifies you as a former Signals Intelligence asset embedded with the 3rd Special Operations Medical Group between 2009 and 2016. Designation Herrenmark. That designation was flagged inactive following your voluntary separation." A brief pause. "We did not reach out to you when you left. That was a decision made above my predecessor's pay grade, and it was, in my assessment, the wrong decision. What you did tonight inside Ravenport Medical suggests that assessment is correct." Elena looked at the wall. The recovery bay curtain moved slightly in the hospital's recycled air. "What do you need from me?" she said. "A conversation. Not tonight. You've earned the right to sleep first. But within 48 hours, I'd like to sit across from you and talk about what Herrenmark actually looked like, what you know about the network we're currently dismantling, and what you want the next chapter of your career to look like if you're open to that conversation. And if I'm not, then you go back to your shift on Thursday, and this call never happened, and we make sure your name disappears from that document so cleanly it was never there." Another pause. "But I don't think that's what you want. I think if it were, you would have left this building 6 hours ago." Elena was quiet for a moment. 48 hours, she said. "I'll have someone reach out." The call ended. She held the phone for a second, then handed it back to Norris, who took it without asking her what had been said. He would be briefed separately. That was how it worked. She stood up from the chair. "I'm going home," she said, to the room in general. Hale looked at her from the bed. "Voss?" She stopped. He held her gaze, and there was something in it that was not the commander-to-asset register, not the patient-to-nurse register, something more level than either of those. "Whatever they offer you," he said, "make sure it's what you actually want, not what they need." She looked at him for a moment. "Is that what you did?" He considered it. "No," he said, but I probably should have." She almost smiled. It was the closest she'd come to it all night. She walked out of the recovery bay into the corridor, past Ryle, past Mace, who watched her go with his steady working dog eyes, and she went to the locker room and changed into her own clothes and drove home in the early morning light, with the windows down because she needed cold air on her face. And the city outside looked the way cities looked at 7:45 a.m. when they were just waking up and had no idea what had happened inside one of their buildings while they slept. She slept for 11 hours. She woke up with her hip bruised purple from the crash cart and her phone full of missed calls she didn't return until she'd eaten something and sat with her coffee for long enough to feel like herself again. The calls were from Finch, from Perro's administrative supervisor, which was going to be a complicated conversation, from a number she didn't recognize that turned out to be a DOD administrative line asking to schedule the meeting Calloway had referenced, and from her mother in Duluth, who called every Wednesday regardless of what was happening in the world and would be annoyed that Elena had missed it. She called her mother back first. Her mother talked for 20 minutes about a neighbor's tree that had dropped a branch on the fence, and Elena sat on her kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet and listened and said the right things at the right intervals, and felt, for those 20 minutes, like someone who had a completely ordinary life, which was its own kind of medicine. After she hung up, she sat there for a while longer. She thought about what Calloway had said. She thought about what Hale had said. She thought about the 7 years she'd spent building a life that fit inside the walls of Ravenport Medical, the locker with her name on it, the parking spot she'd claimed by default, the rhythms of a shift she could run in her sleep. She'd built it deliberately. She'd needed something that stayed in one place after years of things that never did. She didn't regret any of it. The patients she'd kept alive, the ordinary ones, the 3 a.m. chest pains and the car accident victims and the children with fevers and the elderly people who were scared and alone, those weren't lesser work. She'd done real things in that building before last night and independent of it. But she thought about Mace's eyes when she'd crouched down to his level and told him Hale was in surgery. The absolute uncomplicated trust of an animal who had determined she was worth listening to. She thought about the moment she'd said "Ruhag" in the trauma bay and the room had gone silent. She thought about what it felt like to be known for the real thing. She made the appointment for 47 hours out and went back to bed. The institutional reckoning for Dr. Perro unfolded over the following 3 weeks in the way institutional reckonings did. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in layers, each one more final than the last. The hospital board convened an emergency review within 48 hours of the incident. This was driven partly by the DOD's formal notification to the hospital's legal team and partly by Finch, who had submitted a written incident report so thorough and unsparing that it left the board very little interpretive room. Elena was asked to provide a statement. She provided one, in writing, 11 pages, factual and sequential, without editorializing. She did not need to editorialize. The facts were sufficient. Perro's medical license was suspended pending investigation within the first week. The suspension was not temporary language. The language used by the licensing board was pending revocation proceedings, which was different. His hospital privileges were terminated the same day as the suspension, which meant he didn't have a building to return to while the proceedings worked themselves out. The criminal charges came through the federal system, not the state system, which meant they arrived with a different weight and a different timeline. Wire fraud, conspiracy to interfere with a federal protective operation, and accessory to assault, the last charge connecting him to Falk's attempt on Hale's life through the information Perro had provided. His attorney entered a not guilty plea that nobody in the DA's office or the DOD's legal division seemed particularly worried about. Elena followed this from a distance. She got updates from Norris, who had developed the habit of sending her brief, factual messages at intervals that were more frequent than she'd expected from him. She got updates from Finch, who had developed the habit of calling her on her days off and describing the current state of the hospital's administrative disarray with a dry precision that was its own form of humor. The board is talking about a patient safety review of all physician credentialing in the last 3 years, Finch said, on a Tuesday morning, 2 weeks in, which is necessary and overdue and is going to make my life a nightmare for 6 months, but there it is. It's the right thing, Elena said. Oh, absolutely. Still going to be a nightmare. A pause. You coming back Thursday? I'm back Thursday. Good. Another pause, longer. Voss, what you did that night, I want you to know I heard the full account. From Norris, from Pruitt, from Valdez. A beat. I've worked with you for 4 years and I didn't know. Nobody knew, Elena said. That was the point. I understand that. I just... Finch paused again, which was unusual for her. I wanted to say, I'm glad you were there. Not because of what you used to be, because of what you did. Elena held the phone for a moment. Thank you, Deborah. It was the first time she'd used Finch's first name in 4 years of working together. A beat on the line. See you Thursday, Finch said, and hung up. Gregor Falk was charged through the federal system and held without bail, which was standard for cases involving attacks on protected federal assets. His attorney made 2 motions in the first 2 weeks, both denied. His cooperation with investigators was minimal, but not zero. He gave up enough to confirm the operational structure that the Command Elements Analysis Team had already largely reconstructed, which meant his cooperation earned him nothing. He'd been hoping it would earn him and a great deal of documentation that made his eventual sentencing easier to calculate. The network Falk had been contracted through, the one Calloway had described as under active investigation for 30 months, did not collapse as a result of these arrests. Networks like that didn't collapse from the arrest of their operational periphery. What they did was contract, becoming more careful and more expensive and harder to reach. 3 of the network's known supply channels went quiet within 2 weeks of Falk's arrest, which the command element logged as significant pressure. The observation post at the Millhaven Suites yielded enough device forensics to add 14 data points to the existing map. It was not over. These things were never cleanly over, but it was measurably smaller and the shape of it was clearer, and that was what progress looked like in spaces where the work was slow and cumulative and rarely arrived with clean endings. Elena learned this because Calloway told her, in the meeting that happened on Hour 47, in a nondescript building in a commercial district 20 minutes from Ravenport Medical, in a room with no windows and very good coffee. Calloway was shorter in person than her voice suggested. Mid-60s, compact, with reading glasses she kept pushing up, and a habit of setting her pen down when she was about to say something she wanted to land without distraction. She set the pen down. Herrenmark was deactivated because you requested separation, and your handler at the time didn't fight for retention. He's no longer with the agency, and his reasoning at the time is no longer something I can interrogate. She looked at Elena directly. I'm not going to pretend the system treated you correctly when you left. It didn't. You built something that worked. You served it for 7 years, and when you were done, it let you walk out a side door with a handshake and a file stamp. Elena said nothing. What I'm offering, Calloway said, is not a reinstatement. Your designation was for a specific operational context that no longer exists in the same form. What I'm offering is a consultancy role, structured, your terms on availability, focused specifically on medical operations intelligence, assessing field casualty scenarios, evaluating medical facility vulnerabilities in sensitive environments, training elements on trauma protocol in non-permissive settings. She paused. You would not be in the field, unless you wanted to be, and that would be a separate conversation. What does it pay? Elena said. Calloway almost smiled. Better than Ravenport Medical. I'm not leaving Ravenport Medical. I know, I'm not asking you to. She pushed her glasses up. This is concurrent. You keep your shift, you keep your life, and you take projects when they fit your schedule and your judgment says they're worth taking. No coercion, no obligation beyond the individual engagement, and full legal protection for your existing identity and employment. Elena looked at this coffee in her hands. She thought about what she'd said to Hale. I'm a nurse. That's not a deflection. It's what I am now. She still meant it. That hadn't changed. But she'd also spent 7 years convincing herself that the other thing, say, the thing that had known how to read a building schematic at midnight and identify a service corridor threat and talk to a military working dog in German, that thing was over, filed away, unnecessary. And the truth was, it had never been unnecessary. It had just been unused. I want it in writing, she said. Everything you said. Terms, scope, exit clause, protection provisions. Of course. And I want Hale's operation to be fully cleared before I sign anything. Whatever investigation is still running on the attack, I want it closed, officially. Calloway looked at her with something that was not quite surprise. Why? Because he's the reason any of this came to light. If the investigation drags and his record gets complicated by the events of that night, by anything that happened in or around that hospital, I want it on record that he performed his duty under extraordinary circumstances and that the security failure was not his. She held Calloway's gaze. He lost his handler. He nearly died. He spent the worst night of his recent life in a hospital where someone inside was actively working against him. His record should reflect none of that as a failure point. Calloway was quiet for a moment. That's already in process, she said. His formal commendation was submitted last week. Good, Elena said. Then we have a lot to discuss. She was back on shift Thursday. The hospital felt the same and different in the way places did after something significant had happened in them. Same walls, same smell of antiseptic and institutional carpet, same rhythm of handoffs and pages, and the particular low-register noise of a building that ran all night. But it wore the recent history of itself differently, the way people did. The East Corridor had new camera equipment installed. The service corridor required a dual-badge entry now, a change that facilities management had implemented in 48 hours flat, which was faster than anything Elena had seen the hospital's facilities team accomplish in 4 years of normal operations. Finch was at the station when Elena came on. She looked at her badge and didn't say anything about the time, which was exactly on the dot. Room 6 needs a new IV line, Finch said. Room 9 is a post-op from yesterday who's anxious and needs someone to talk to more than she needs medication. And there's a new admit in 4 who came in with the family, all of them, and I need you to manage the family. On it, Elena said. She went. Hale's official discharge from Harkerfield Medical came through 5 weeks after the night at Ravenport. Elena knew this because Norris sent her a message. He'd developed a distinctly non-federal habit of sending short messages about things he thought she'd want to know. That said simply, Hale cleared for full duty resumption pending 6-week PT. Doing well. She sent back good, and meant it in more directions than the word could carry. She did not expect to hear from Hale directly. That wasn't how it worked between people who'd shared something in a crisis and then returned to their separate contexts. Those encounters were real, and they mattered, and they didn't necessarily produce ongoing relationships. She understood that and was at peace with it, which was why she was surprised, on a Tuesday evening 4 weeks after Hale's discharge message, when she came off shift to find a single item on the nursing station counter that hadn't been there when she'd come on. A small envelope, sealed, with her name written on the outside in the kind of handwriting that suggested someone who'd been trained to write legibly under field conditions. Inside was a card. Not a store-bought one. A card someone had made from folded paper, the kind of thing you made when you were in a medical facility long enough to find the arts and crafts supply cabinet, but not long enough to send someone to a store. On the front, drawn in ink, was a rough but recognizable sketch of a German shepherd. Inside, 2 lines. Mace retired effective last Friday. He's with me now. Hale. And below that, in smaller letters, as if he'd added it after and wasn't entirely sure it belonged, he still won't listen to anyone who doesn't know the word. She stood at the station and read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her pocket and went to find Finch to hand off the end-of-shift notes. And she did this with the specific quality of someone who was carrying something warm and didn't need to show it to anyone to know it was there. What people missed when they looked at Elena Voss, and people had been missing it for years at Ravenport Medical and before it and probably for some time before that, was not the skills. It wasn't the German or the building schematics or the ability to read a room's threat geometry while pulling an IV line. Those were tools. You could acquire tools. What they missed was the decision. She had chosen this, not as a retreat and not as a hiding place and not as a punishment for whatever had happened in the years she didn't discuss. She had chosen a hospital in a mid-sized city that the interstate had mostly bypassed because she'd needed, for a while, to do work that was bounded, that had walls, that let her know, at the end of a shift, what she'd accomplished. A person stable who had arrived unstable. A family reassured. A line caught before it failed. Clean, immediate, human-scale results, in a context that didn't require her to wonder for years whether what she'd done had mattered. She'd needed that. She wasn't ashamed of having needed it. But she'd also always known the way you knew things about yourself that you didn't particularly want to examine, that bounded work was not the only work she was capable of, that the other thing hadn't gone away, that one day it would be relevant again, and she would discover whether she'd put it down permanently or just set it aside. She knew the answer now. The evening after Hale's card arrived, she signed Calloway's consultancy agreement. She read every line of it. She wasn't the kind of person who didn't read every line. And she made 2 small revisions that Calloway's office accepted within 24 hours. And she signed it in her apartment in the early evening with the window open and the sounds of the city coming in. And it didn't feel like a return to anything. It felt like a different kind of forward. Perro's license revocation was finalized 6 weeks after the incident, at a hearing Elena didn't attend because she hadn't been asked to and because her written statement was already in the record, and her presence would have been redundant. The board's finding was published in the state medical registry, which was public, which meant that anyone who searched his name would find it. The language was formal and was also damning in the way that only formal language could be. Every word chosen precisely, every finding stated without hedging, the conclusion arrived at without ambiguity. His federal charges were resolved 3 months later with a plea agreement that his attorney negotiated down from the original count of conspiracy, but which still resulted in a 4-year federal sentence and a permanent bar from any position requiring security clearance or medical licensure. His name went into 3 separate databases that tracked insider threats to protected federal operations. He would be findable in those databases for the rest of his working life. Elena heard about the plea agreement from Norris. She sat with it for a while, the way you sat with outcomes that were correct and insufficient at the same time. Perro was going to serve time. He was going to lose his license and his career and his standing, and all of that was appropriate. And Hale had still nearly died on a table with an open chest because of choices Perro had made in the supply room of a hospital where he'd worked for 6 years and done his job well on all the ordinary nights. Both of those things were true simultaneously. That was the part nobody told you about justice, that it was real and important, and rarely gave you what you were actually looking for, which was the ability to unknow what you now knew about how things could fall apart. You learned to carry it, or you didn't, and the weight changed your shape. Elena had been carrying things long enough to know which option was sustainable. She was on shift on a Thursday night in late autumn when the call came through, a paramedic's voice on the radio, running hard, describing a multi-vehicle accident on the bridge approach with a critical patient incoming. She had the trauma bay prepped in 3 minutes. She had her team positioned. She had the IV lines and the crash cart and the airway tray and every element of a controlled response to an uncontrolled situation. When the gurney came through the door, she was ready. She was always ready. That was the thing that had been true before anyone knew it was true. Through 7 years of a different kind of work, and 4 years of this kind, through a night that had asked her to be everything she was at once, and had revealed it to everyone who'd been paying insufficient attention. She was ready, not because she was exceptional, and not because she was unafraid, and not because nothing touched her. She was ready because she'd learned, in field hospitals and trauma bays and dark corridors, and the particular education of nights that didn't go the way anyone planned. That readiness was not a state you arrived at and maintained. It was a choice you made again and again, in the small moments between the large ones, in the ordinary Tuesdays, and the shift handoffs and the charts, and the rooms that needed IV lines, and the families that needed someone to talk them down from the edge of their fear. She made the choice. Every shift, every room, every time. That was the thing they'd underestimated. Not her background, not her skills, not the words she'd said in German in a trauma bay at midnight and the dog who'd listened. What they'd underestimated was that she'd decided quietly and without announcement to be exactly what was needed, regardless of whether anyone knew it. And the not knowing, it turned out, had never diminished it. The work had been real whether or not anyone was watching. The patients had survived whether or not anyone understood what it had cost. The night had been what it was, whether or not any of the people in that building had looked at Elena Voss and seen her clearly. She had seen herself clearly. That was enough. It had always been enough. The gurney came through the doors and she stepped forward and did her job, and the city went on around her, and somewhere across town a retired German shepherd was sleeping with his head on the boots of a man who'd made it through the worst night of his recent life, and neither of them needed anyone else to understand what they'd survived together to know that they had. Some things were like that. Some things you just carried quietly, in your hands, where they belonged.